Well, as we come to the end of this year, I want to invite you to join with the Family Research Council and Washington Watch as we prepare for 2024. It's going to be a big year. It's going to be a lot going on. And we've got some folks that have put forward a matching challenge so that whatever you give between now and December 31st will be matched. It'll be doubled. So if you give a gift today, well, if you give $20, it becomes $40. $50 becomes $100. $100,000 becomes $200,000. So get your checkbook out. But seriously, we've got folks standing by from our team are standing by to take your call. So give us a call. Don't let it be lonely. Call them 800-225-4008. That's 800-225-4008. All right, we're going to continue the discussion on the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. It's a busy time here in Washington, D.C. with the possible advancement of presidential impeachment proceedings or inquiry next week. But with the few legislative days remaining, which is basically next week, the NDAA remains the largest annual bill on Congress's plate leading up to the Christmas recess. But the question is, will House Republicans pass this really gutted version of the NDAA that includes the left's priorities of taxpayer funding of abortion, trans surgeries? Joining me now to discuss this is Suzanne Bowdey, editorial director and senior writer at the Washington Stand, who published a commentary this morning on the NDAA abortion battle. Suzanne, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks, Tony. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you. By the way, before we get started, tell folks about how they can find out what's happening at the Stand.
Yeah, we publish news from a biblical worldview. You can find us at thewashingtonstand.com. We have commentary, we have news. We're touching on all the things happening on the Hill. We're touching also on the guests that you have on radio show, just breaking news.
So if people want the written version of Washington Watch, they often get, when I do a good job, they can get, they can read about it. So let's talk about the NDAA battle that is really being teed up for next week. This comes this week, Coach Tuberville ended his 10-month hold on military promotions, which really brought attention to this illegal abortion travel policy. Now, some of those defending this are saying, well, the Pentagon's reporting that only 12 women took advantage of this. So we're only talking about 12 abortions. So what's the big deal?
It's 12 lives. Would we say that if there were a shooting and 12 children were dead? These are individual precious human lives. It doesn't matter the number of lives that are lost. It's the principle of the thing. And in fact, they're saying 12 people have taken advantage of this policy, but the Biden administration actually admitted to the Heritage Foundation that this could escalate. It may be 12 women now. It could be 4,000 women in years to come. So we're not just talking about 12 quote-unquote lives.
Well, isn't that the case when prior to the Hyde Amendment, when the federal government was funding abortion? What happens when the government funds something?
Whenever the government subsidizes something, it expands. We saw that, I was here back in the Obamacare debates. We tracked what would happen if taxpayer-funded abortion was included in healthcare. And what you saw was a massive increase, as much as 40%, when we're not acting under the Hyde Amendment, which doesn't allow taxpayer funding to go for abortion. And it certainly shouldn't here. The Biden administration acted unilaterally. I heard you talking to the congressman before, and you asked, what kind of precedent would this set? And the precedent that it would set is that you don't need Congress to legislate. Right. You can just make up your own rules as you go. There's an executive branch and a legislative branch for a reason, and Biden has overstepped his boundaries.
A very good point. There are really two issues here. One is, the issue of, it's just 12, and you're absolutely right, it will grow. Mm-hmm. But if someone commits one murder, they're a murderer.
Right.
If they commit mass murder, they're a murderer. The moral situation is still the same.
Exactly.
It is the taking of unborn life. So whether it's one life, 12 lives, 12,000 lives, 12 million lives, the principle is there. It matters. Right. So it sets a precedent, number one, that for 4 decades we've had this agreement that taxpayers are not going to be entangled in this funding scheme for abortion. So that's number one. But your second point needs a lot of attention, because if Congress allows an administration to unilaterally ignore the law, what's next?
Well, they're making themselves irrelevant, which I think is interesting. I don't understand why the Senate is not lining up to say, this is our job, this isn't your job.
I'm not so sure that that's really the mindset of many in Congress. You know, for years they allowed the courts to do a lot of this stuff, and they would say, "Oh, the court is taken away," but in the, you know, behind the scenes they were clapping about it because they didn't have to make difficult votes.
Didn't want to get their hands dirty.
Just like on the issue of abortion, the courts took it out of the hands of lawmakers for years, but now it's back into their hands. They don't want to deal with it. And this is a prime example because they're allowing the Biden administration to unilaterally make the decisions, and they don't want to vote on it.
And yet they'll go to the mat on the border. They'll go to the mat on funding for Ukraine. But this is a bright red line, as you've called it, that if once we cross it, we can't go back.
Right.
What about taxpayer-funded abortion in healthcare, as you've said, or everywhere? I mean,
Once
you just can't return.
Once you give evil an inch, it will take a mile.
And we saw this with the Obamacare debate. I mean, this isn't the first time that Democrats have tried to bring taxpayer-funded abortion into legislative policy. The difference now is they're not trying to do it legislatively. They're bypassing Congress, and that's where the American people really need to get involved and say this is not about 12 lives. This is not even about the NDAA. This is about our system of government, and it's about the way we need to work moving forward.
They have pushed, they're going to push Republicans to the wall and say this is about national security. That's what the FISA is being interjected into this. If you don't do this, America's going to be attacked. But these are principles that this nation has been standing upon, the rule of law, for nearly 240 years. And so to allow them to be attacked by the left, the damage would be irreparable.
Right. And Speaker Johnson, is in a tight spot. He's got a very narrow majority. So the more people weigh in, even if you think your congressman isn't paying attention to them, you need to make them pay attention to this issue.
So I was reading some articles today criticizing the Republicans because they've really got nothing done. And they haven't passed a lot of stuff. They've got the funding gun. The government didn't shut down. They've got the NDAA teed up. And, you know, they were saying, well, this is a do-nothing Congress.
Yeah, well, they call the Senate the most deliberative body in the world. And in this case, we don't want them to deliberate anymore. If they're going to pass an NDAA that funds taxpayer-funded abortion and DEI, drag shows, we're also talking about taxpayer-funded gender transition surgeries in the military.
That was actually taken out of the House.
That's not gotten any attention, but that's actually a way bigger expense and also just a heinous thing that we would be pulling men and women who are having trouble recruiting out of the line of duty, paying for their surgeries, then they're undeployable. That's also been stripped out of the NDAA.
Well, actually, I think in many cases that's being used to recruit people who are...
Come get free surgery.
Right, exactly. But I actually think that a do-nothing Congress is good because I can't recall when Congress did anything good for the American people. As long as they keep us safe and take care of the basics, I don't want Congress doing things. I think gridlock is good because it provides some stability. I mean, you think about it, we talked about this with Congressman Burleson. The Republicans have a 3-seat margin. It's soon to be down to 1.
Right.
So you've got one chamber out of the congressional legislative branch. Then you've got to deal with the executive branch controlled by Biden. So the Republicans have very little that they could do. They certainly can't advance anything in this environment. So if they can kill stuff, all the better.
Right. And I'm very interested. You're on the Hill a lot, so I'm going to turn the tables on you. But what are you hearing? Is there a possibility for a grand bargain where we're talking about the NDAA before the end of the week, Ukraine aid bundled with Israel, and also so many things? Do you think they can get that done? What are you hearing?
Well, I do think that the supplemental funding for Ukraine with border security issues has the highest probability of passing.
Because the Republicans are united.
They're united on the border. The American public has elevated that issue to probably the #1 national security issue.
With bipartisan support.
Right, with bipartisan support. And in the rare occurrence of the Senate Republicans this week voting against the $105 billion supplemental, that makes it very clear to Chuck Schumer, the scare leader in the Senate, that there's no path forward without it. And so even today, President Biden signaling that he's willing to make some negotiations. Now, the good news, and we've talked about this on the program with members of the Senate, is that they're smarter than just to accept more government funding for border security and window dressing. They want numbers.
Right.
They want to show a reduction since we this week set another record with illegal crossings.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the United Nations, and today, in fact, this was a little surprising. Robert Woods, the ambassador to the United Nations, in the Security Council, an emergency meeting called by Guterres, the Secretary General, using Article 99, which hasn't been used since 1971, used it to try to force a ceasefire on Israel. That effort failed this afternoon, about an hour and a half ago.
Right, and it failed because the United States vetoed it, and the United States was the only country to veto it, which is shocking, I believe, when you consider all that's gone on in Israel, the videos that have been released, the atrocities that we know that have been committed there. It's shocking to me, but I am grateful that the United States found its spine and did decide to say, hey, this isn't a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. What happened on October 7th was the humanitarian crisis against innocent civilians.
You know, I don't want to see anybody, I don't want to see any loss of life, but I've been there many times, and if the Israelis are not allowed to secure their own country, America is going to pay a price for that. And we need to ignore the United Nations and this Secretary General, Guterres. The United States should not give a penny to this moron who is running the place. I want to play this clip from October 24th that he had and just show you kind of his orientation. Clip 10, please.
The attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing.
I mean, the only vacuum is, between his ears when it comes to understanding what's happening here. And this is, the United Nations has become not just, I'm trying to be careful what I say here. They're no longer just a distraction.
No.
They are advocating for the enemies of freedom.
Right. They've become a satellite office of Hamas. And you have to wonder what is happening at the UN. What do you think their agenda is in this? What do you think his end game is?
It is certainly not to stand with Israel or freedom. It is to advance the Marxist ideology and the agenda of radical Islamists. So we're out of time on this conversation, but look, the United States should get out of the United Nations. We should not be funding them at all. Trump had us moving in the right direction, Biden in the wrong. Suzanne Bowdey, thanks so much for joining us. I hope you have something to write about now.
I sure do. Thanks, Tony.